For the 20 years following World War I, American naval forces developed and refined new strategies to employ their latest weapon of the seas. Mock engagements demonstrated the carrier's ability to act as both a powerful aggressor and worthy defender. Ironically, training raids on Pearl Harbor during the 1930s would reveal the Navy's own vulnerability to carrier attack. This weakness would soon be exploited by Japanese carriers as their surprise attack would overwhelm U.S. forces and thrust America into war.
In 1928, the United States Navy operated 3 carriers, Lexington, Saratoga, and their incongruous predecessor, the Langley. The value of the service of these 3 ships is almost impossible to overestimate. The Navy used them to experiment with the aircraft carrier, in separate task groups and as task forces, as powerful weapons in their own right, rather than as handy accessories for the fleet. If kept tied to the fleet and subsidiary to its big guns, the carrier would never be able to fulfill its potential. Large carriers, with their range, speed, and striking power, were patently capable of far greater things. In a series of naval exercises, the carriers demonstrated the role that the aviation specialist wanted them to fill, and the results showed clearly that there was more than a grain of truth in the carrier enthusiasts' theories. The first of these significant events was performed by the Langley, at a time when the Naval Planning Board was still preoccupied with questions of fleet gunnery. The little experimental carrier provided a sobering moment during the 1928 exercise on Fleet Problem 8. Ignoring conventional concerns with battleships, the Langley stole up on Pearl Harbor unobserved and mounted an aerial raid that achieved total surprise, theoretically causing much damage to the installations there. A year later, with the exercises of Fleet Problem 9, it was to be her big sisters, Lexington and Saratoga, who stole the show. The exercise was based around the Panama Canal, and the 2 carriers were split, Lexington to the canal defenders and Saratoga to the attackers.
In the spring of 1929, the entire West Coast fleet went south to the Panama area. It was really an annual set of war games, this time primarily to demonstrate the effectiveness of the new carriers, then new carriers, and the new technique of dive bombing. For this war game exercise, the fleet was divided in 2 parts. Admiral Reeves had command of the attacking force with the Saratoga and all its accompanying ships. He decided for the purpose of this exercise to go far south in a huge semicircle to avoid early detection, planned to arrive within striking range of the Panama locks before dawn. The evening before the attack, Admiral Reeves sent for me. He said he was becoming concerned lest he might have been detected by surface vessels during the night, and he wanted to make sure of getting at least one attack through. He proposed to launch me and my squadron at 2 a.m. He asked if I could do it. I said yes, just because I wanted to do the job, even though this would be the first time any full squadron had ever been launched from far at sea during the night. Everything went beautifully. We arrived over the locks just before dawn, still dark on the ground. We launched a perfectly wonderful dive bombing attack, split attack.
Everybody was just absent, and we romped up and down the field and, in theory, destroyed all their aircraft. Well, the umpires, the declared that the battle fleet had won the war because the Panama Canal had been so damaged by this air attack that it was out of commission.
We arrived back at the carrier right on time, right where she belonged and where we belonged, landed everything safely. Admiral Reeves was so pleased he couldn't wait, but came running down to the flight deck to ask how things had gone. As for all of us, we all felt that this really had unveiled carrier aviation and the new technique of dive bombing, and this was certainly proved true in later years.
The results were confused by the umpires, with both carriers being declared sunk, Saratoga officially having gone down twice. However, Saratoga was also credited with achieving total surprise in her air attack, and the Canal was adjudged to have been put out of action by her. The dual lessons to be learned were that the carriers needed to pay more attention to defense, and that everyone else needed to pay more attention to the carrier's offensive capability. The lessons of the 1929 exercise were to be repeated throughout the years up to the war. On two further occasions, in 1932 and 1938, Pearl Harbor was to be the recipient of successful mock raids. If the war games sound frivolous, we must remember that they paid their dividends in the forming and practice of procedures. From the flag bridge to the flight deck, naval personnel were engaged in learning about their new weapons. The admirals and captains had to learn to handle their ships and their striking force with the same fluency and tactical confidence as the battleship commanders. In the air, the Navy's planes continued to hone the biplane arrangement. The added lift of the dual wings allowed much slower and therefore safer approach speeds and considerably shortened the takeoff. However, as the 30s progressed, there were rapid developments in monoplane designs. This meant that the biplane's advantages were being increasingly outweighed by their vulnerability, and in the event of war, the carriers would be as obsolete as their planes. The Navy's first purpose-designed and built carrier, Ranger, was launched in 1933 and reflected a desire to multiply the available fleet air capability. The various naval treaties had left the U.S. with an unfilled allocation for carriers, and it was intended to fill the quota with small carriers, hence obtaining more of them. Ranger was the first, but at only 13,000 tons, she was never an effective attack carrier. She was too slow to operate with the larger carriers and too vulnerable to do much on her own. Next to be launched was the Yorktown, first of 3 vessels in her class, Yorktown and Enterprise coming off the slips in 1936, and the third, Hornet, in 1940. These 3, at around 20,000 tons, were far more effective ships than Ranger. The only other carrier added to the fleet before the U.S. involvement in World War II was to be another small carrier, Wasp. She repeated most of the failings of Ranger, again too small, lacking in armor, and underpowered. With Langley rebuilt and reallocated as an aircraft ferry, the U.S. had the 7 carriers it was able to deploy as it entered the war. The Essex class, which had been designed and perfected on the basis of the Navy's now extensive carrier experience, the ships that were to be so critical in the coming conflict, would not start commissioning until December 1942. The years of peace passed with increasing tension, and there was a sense of real urgency in the approach of many in the United States Defense Forces, who, foreseeing coming conflict, were determined to be ready for it when it came. Among them was Admiral King, who commanded the Carrier Task Group in the 1938 exercises that again revealed the vulnerability of Pearl Harbor. For the 3rd time, American carriers were able to approach undetected and launch large, successful raids on the island's defenses. There were obviously many lessons for Honolulu's defenders to learn. As the United States' main forward Pacific base, Pearl Harbor's importance and vulnerability were glaringly obvious.
This time we had the Saratoga and the Lexington. both on our side. And the idea was that we were going in and wreck the Navy Yard and attack and bomb and torpedo and sink any ships we could find there. In the meantime, the fighters would immobilize and pin down any Air Force fighters we found.
This could well be a description of the Japanese attack 3 years later. The successful fleet exercises continued to probe at the adequacy of existing arrangements and find disturbing evidence that in many respects, the nation was clearly unprepared to engage in a major conflict. President Roosevelt's arrival at the White House had at last restored executive support for the Navy, but there was a lot to be made up, and Congress, still isolationist, was unconvinced of the financial wisdom of large capital expenditures on defense. But the time for preparing for war was running out fast. In the Pacific, there was only one possible opponent, Japan. But many Americans found it difficult to believe that the medieval-looking society represented any significant threat. This was despite the evidence of Japan's militarism, industrial strength, and determined expansionism. The Japanese, for all their aggression in Manchuria and China, did not seem silly enough to pick a fight with someone they couldn't beat. Japan's belligerence was seen as bluff. Her industrial base, though vigorous, was too small, and her lack of most of the list of strategic materials was so obvious that American policy toward Japan often seemed dismissive and abrupt. Largely unknown was the sophistication of her armaments and the skill of her armed forces. The growing close relationship between Japan, however, many of the United States defense planners had long been aware of Japan's military power and took it very seriously. The rising sun of Japan had showed itself to be ruthless. The efficiency and determination of her soldiers and the direct battle plans of her generals had seen her outmaneuver her opponents. Her navy was one of the world's largest and best, and had a highly developed fleet of 6 large carriers and 3 small ones. This gave them a numerical advantage over the American fleet of 9 to 7. And all the Japanese fleet was based on the home islands, while the American Pacific Fleet actually deployed only 3 of the United States carriers. The Japanese carriers were a mixed bag, ranging from excellent to nearly useless. The 3 small carriers were of little threat, but the large carriers were a different matter, and it was these ships which formed the raid on Pearl Harbor. It would not be the first time that Japan had gone to war unannounced. In 1904, the conflict between Japan and Russia had commenced with the Japanese fleet arriving off the Port Arthur Naval Base and attacking it. Surprise was total, and the victory devastating. Japan had stated a claim to the whole of Southeast Asia, including the Philippines and the American possession of Guam, in what they called a co-prosperity zone. By any name, what they wanted was an empire. In the 10 years following their invasion of Manchuria in 1931, they had fought China and the Soviets. In 1940, they annexed French territories in Indochina. Importantly, in terms of a Japanese sense of invincibility, they had never been defeated in a war. When in July 1941, the Western powers imposed a trade embargo that cut off most of Japan's strategic needs, the generals who controlled the government, confident both of Axis backing and surprise, decided on war. In Hawaii, the staff was preoccupied with the possibility of war with Japan and had prepared against attack. Unfortunately, the wrong attack. Fearing sabotage from the local Japanese, they grouped their planes and ships where they could be protected. That the attack would be from waves of carrier-based aircraft was not allowed for, and the arrangements made were the worst possible defense against air attack. The skilled Japanese pilots with years of battle experience would be presented with bombing practice against massed targets. On the evening of Saturday, the 6th of December, there were nearly 80 vessels in the port, including the Pacific Battle Line's 8 battleships. Overnight, the Japanese carriers and their heavy battle screen closed to striking range. In the morning, a lot of history would be made, including the settlement of all debate about the power of naval aviation. Between 6 o'clock and 7:15, 360 planes took off from the 6 carriers 200 miles north of the islands. They consisted of 81 fighters, 104 bombers, 40 torpedo planes, and 135 dive bombers. After forming up into their groups, they set course for Oahu. At 7:55, they arrived over Pearl Harbor, where the radar operators were still wondering who they were, and without more ado, began their attack. The defenders were totally unprepared for what hit them that morning, and were unable to put up much of a defense. For half an hour, the Japanese did what they had come for with little interference. The airfields were hit in the first wave with simultaneous torpedo attacks in the harbor. The harbor became an inferno of burning ships, and the crews fought desperately on 2 fronts, to save their ships and to strike back at the planes. After a 10-minute lull, the bombers began their runs. From then, the destruction continued without stopping as the second wave of torpedoes and bombs followed. Around 9:45, it was all over. The Japanese lost only 29 planes that morning, a small price for the victory they had achieved, and they left no doubt in anyone's mind that America and Japan were at war. The American price was much higher. The disaster that had been sprung that morning shocked the islands and the nation. The attackers had sunk or severely damaged 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, 4 other ships, and over 180 planes. In the midst of the destruction, there were 2 brighter notes. The Japanese victory had not been total. They had not sunk any carriers, and the fuel stores at Pearl were unharmed. One target they had missed, the other had not been in port. The carriers were off ferrying new planes to reinforce Marine garrisons in case war should break out. The airfields had been a priority target, as would any carriers the Japanese had trapped in port. Admiral Nagumo, the Japanese commander, had been bitterly disappointed that there were no flat tops to sink. The attacks on the airfields had been essentially defensive to protect the incoming planes, whereas the destruction of the carriers would have been an offensive coup. Casualties at Pearl Harbor were high, 2,403 killed and 1,178 wounded. But amid the carnage and destruction, the escape of the carriers was the germ of Japan's eventual defeat. The Japanese Naval Command set a high priority on their destruction, and their eagerness to confront and destroy the carriers was to lead them into their own disaster at Midway. Self-contained, fast and heavily armed, the American ships at large were the sole remaining major obstacle to Japan's expansive plans. When Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor, the crew, even though they were well aware of reports of what had happened, were still shocked by what they saw. Admiral Halsey and his men sailed back into a port that was a caricature of the one they had left. She had been only 200 miles away during the raid, and one of the first planes shot down that morning had been one of her patrol planes, flying into the unexpected battle. Fortunately, the Japanese had not realized a carrier was almost in striking distance, or the Enterprise may have had a wartime career only slightly longer than that of the battleships in port. In a shakeup of the Pacific Fleet staff, Admiral Kimmel was replaced by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. In time, this would be confirmed as a brilliant appointment. Though the Japanese were now set to enjoy 6 months in which they swept across Asia, The industrial might of the United States, which already had been harnessed into somewhat belated activity by the Roosevelt administration, swung into higher gear. The empire was to be far shorter-lived than the Japanese believed. Mobilization of the United States' immense resources saw staggering increases in the size of the nation's armed forces. Within a year of Pearl Harbor, the Navy had signed on over 900,000 volunteers to bring its strength to over 1.2 million men. To match this recruitment, the Navy had to overcome its already recognized shortage of equipment. More of everything was needed, but particularly aircraft carriers. The parallel civilian mobilization in the shipyards and factories would be the key to victory. Naval strength had obviously not been enhanced with the losses at Pearl Harbor, and over the course of the dark year ahead, the existing carriers would carry a heavy load. Meanwhile, in Battleship Row, the salvage crews worked on the wrecks.